All right, well, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Good evening from Wellington. My name is David Cappy. I'm Professor of International Relations here at Te Herenga Waka, Victoria University of Wellington, and I'm Director of the Centre for Strategic Studies. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar, launching a special section of the Australian Journal of International Affairs on the Australia-New Zealand alliance. I think it's a little bit of an understatement to say that these are turbulent times in international politics. We have war raging in Europe and the Middle East, coercion on display across maritime East Asia, and long-standing orthodoxies around trade and economic cooperation seem to have been turned upside down. And as we've even seen just in Seoul in the last 48 hours or so, a lot of long-standing certainties in our region suddenly seem up for grabs. And in times of upheaval and uncertainty and unpredictability, there is one rule I think that applies, and that is that you want your friends close by. And the Australia-New Zealand relationship is, by any measure, I think, one of the closest between any two sovereign states anywhere in the world. The two countries enjoy incredibly integrated economies. We enjoy free movement of people between the two of us, with 600,000 New Zealanders contributing richly to life in Australia. We share an enormous degree of like-mindedness when it comes to our region and international order. And opinion polls such as those from the Lowy Foundation and the Asia New Zealand Foundation frequently tell us that Australians and New Zealanders regard each other as their country's best friend. But if there is one part of this relationship that perhaps hasn't had the close scrutiny, close attention that it maybe deserves in recent years, it's the trans-Tasman defence and security relationship, which is, of course, formalised in the 1951 ANZUS Treaty. For understandable reasons, perhaps, Australian strategists and commentators sometimes tend to focus on their alliance with the United States, to the point that we've seen that alliance in recent years get a capital A in strategic documents. Conversely, on this side of the Tasman, you would probably struggle to find a lot of coverage of the Australian-New Zealand alliance in the news media, or say Australian politics taught in New Zealand universities. And as High Commissioner Harinder Sidhu said in a speech in June, it's surprising that despite how very close our two countries are, we don't really understand each other as much as we could. At times, we take each other for granted. Happily, a recent special section of the Australian Journal of International Affairs, edited by two of our presenters today, Joanne Wallace and Anna Powles, has sought to remedy that. And the section includes, and if my calculations are right, no fewer than 14 short pieces addressing a wide range of issues in the Australia-New Zealand relationship, covering everything from the alliance itself to relations with China to Indigenous foreign policy and a range of perspectives on AUKUS. And the timing of this special issue and the webinar tonight is a little bit propitious because both Australia and New Zealand's deputy prime ministers and foreign and defence ministers will meet in Auckland tomorrow for the second 2+2 that they've held this year. So it's wonderful to have this opportunity to talk a bit more about the Australia-New Zealand relationship. In terms of our running order tonight, shortly we'll hear from the two editors of the special section, who've also contributed their own standalone essay to this issue. We'll then be joined by two of the contributors who've contributed their own essays, Darren Lim and Jason Young, and then there will be time for questions and discussion. So for those of you who are joining us on the webinar, please submit those questions using the Q&A function, and I'll put them to our speakers as we move along. Please don't hesitate to post them as soon as you have them. So without any further ado from me, can I please introduce our first two speakers who brought this really terrific collection together. They are well known for writing extensively on Australia-New Zealand relations, particularly as they impact the Pacific. Joanne Wallace, Professor of International Relations at the University of Adelaide, and Anna Powles, Associate Professor of International Relations at Massey University here in Wellington. Anna and Joanne, congratulations on this special issue. Your essay in it is provocatively entitled "Different Nightmares, Shared Dreams, Australia and New Zealand's Intuitive Alliance." Can I ask you both to start our discussions with some opening remarks?
Well, thank you, David. I'll start off, and thank you very much for your hosting, and thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon or evening, depending on which side of the Tasman you're on or where you find yourself in the world. So as David mentioned, we're here to launch a special section of the Australian Journal of International Affairs about the Australia-New Zealand Alliance, which Anna and I co-edited. And the special section forms part of our broader Australian Research Council Discovery project that examines the operation and endurance of the Alliance. And for about 6 years, we've been working on these issues, and it was motivated by our interest in how little the Alliance is examined in either country. So in his contribution to our special section, Michael Cohen outlines the origins of the ANZUS military alliance. And in our article, we argue that the military alliance between Australia and New Zealand has developed into a far deeper alignment that stretches into the political, economic and cultural spheres. This includes, as is well known, long-standing military cooperation, which was first forged during the New Zealand Wars, later crystallised as Anzacs on the battlefield of the First World War, and then developed through a series of treaties and agreements. The economic relationship is also vital, facilitated by the 1983 Australia-New Zealand Closer Economic Relations Trade Agreement. There's also long-standing political and diplomatic relations, although we do note in our article that the replacement of COAG, which New Zealand used to attend with the National Cabinet during the COVID-19 pandemic, did remove a long-standing avenue for collaboration. Promisingly, the two governments have recognised this, and they convened the first Australia-New Zealand Climate and Finance Ministers meeting in 2023 and the first Australia-New Zealand Foreign and Defence Ministerial Consultations, ANZMIN, this year. The two countries' Prime Ministers also launched the trans-Tasman roadmap to 2035 at their 2023 leaders meeting. And this was the stated aim, and I quote here, of harnessing all elements of our respective nations' statecraft to advance our interests. There are also very broad and deep bureaucratic relationships, and these reflect the depths of diplomatic, defence, economic policing and people-to-people links. And as David has noted, there's particularly the very large New Zealand diaspora here in Australia. But given the depth of that cooperation, we were surprised that both Australia's 2023 Defence Strategic Review, at least the publicly released summary, and the 2024 National Defence Strategy both characterised New Zealand as a partner rather than an ally. Only the US was described as an ally, and as David noted, with a capital A. But Australia is an ally of both countries under the ANZUS Treaty. That treaty, of course, has been suspended between New Zealand and the US, but it does remain operative between Australia and New Zealand. So we were interested in our article what this reluctance to refer to New Zealand as an ally says about Australia's understanding of its alliance with New Zealand. Has the alliance become irrelevant, or is it so taken for granted and the habits of cooperation so entrenched that it's not seen as necessary to emphasise it? So to answer these questions, we conducted interviews with diplomats and senior officials in both countries. We also interviewed New Zealand Foreign Minister Winston Peters. Unfortunately, Australian Foreign Minister Penny Wong declined to be interviewed. We also brought together experts from both sides of the Tasman in workshops in Canberra and Wellington. And it's a selection of these experts' papers that are published in our special section. And as David's noted, we're joined today by Darren Lim and Jason Young, who are two of our contributors. And they both focus specifically on how the two countries have related to China and an emerging strategic competition. So it'll be a nice contrast hearing their different perspectives in a minute. The process of convening these workshops actually told us a lot about how the two countries view their alliance. In Australia, we had difficulty identifying scholars who work on the alliance with New Zealand, or even work on New Zealand as a foreign and strategic policy actor. Ultimately, we ended up inviting scholars who primarily focus on Australia's alliance with the US and others who have related fields of interest, since they tend to be well acquainted with the scholarly alliance literature. And we are very grateful to the generosity of those scholars, including, as I mentioned, Michael Cohen, Hugh White, Brendan Taylor, and Liz Buchanan, who sought to make their broader research agenda relevant to our workshop questions. We had a lot more luck identifying scholars in New Zealand. This is partly because the question of New Zealand's foreign and strategic policy relationship with Australia was, and of course still is, generating a lot of attention in the context of debates about whether New Zealand should seek to join Pillar 2 of the AUKUS security partnership. And there are a range of differing views of AUKUS represented in our special section by contributions from Rob Packman, Ruben Steff, Kathy Downs, Marco de Jong, Nicholas Ross-Smith and Lauren Bland. Representatives from each High Commission also attended our workshops in both capitals, and we spoke to different ministries in both capitals. Notably, New Zealand diplomat Rob Lars was given approval to contribute to our special section, and you'll see his piece in there. And this reflected a tendency that we did see, that while Australian officials were very comfortable making valuable contributions as background or under Chatham House rules, their New Zealand counterparts tended to seem to at least feel a lot freer to speak and to give quite definite opinions, which I think probably says something interesting that's worth unpacking later. So our article, in differing ways, and those of our contributors, support our argument that the depth and breadth of Australia and New Zealand's defence, economic, regulatory and people-to-people cooperation integration has made their relationship intuitive. And this was a word that we heard from several officials on both sides of the Tasman throughout our research. That is, the relationship has come to be seen as part of the natural order of things. The two countries see each other as a natural, permanent partner, parting company with whom would be unthinkable. And Anna and I argue in our article that the intuitive nature of this relationship reflects the logic of habit. Australian and New Zealand governments and citizenries take the relationship so much for granted that cooperation, integration, and indeed military support in the event of an armed attack on another country has long been assumed to be inevitable. So we argue that this means that their military alliance is so intuitive that it no longer necessitates specific identification as an alliance commitment. And this is our explanation why the 2023 DSR and National Defence Strategy in Australia perhaps felt it wasn't necessary to specifically identify New Zealand as an ally. It's just intuitively taken for granted that our relationship with New Zealand is so deep that there will always be military cooperation and support. But as Hugh White evocatively observed in 2001, while Australia and New Zealand share the same bed, they frequently have different nightmares. And Brendan Taylor revisits this observation in his contribution to our special section. And White's observation captured the dynamic that although Australia has a relatively high sense of strategic vulnerability, it has a strong economy, whereas New Zealand has typically faced the opposite situation. And Anna's now going to discuss how these different nightmares play out in the alliance and what this means for its future. Thank you.
Kia ora koutou. I apologise for possibly poor audio. I'm currently here in Nandi and there's a thunderstorm taking place at the moment, so please bear with me and my apologies. I'd first like to just reiterate Joanne's thanks to David, our chair, and our speakers, Darren and Jason, and to AAA and NZAA for joining us to launch this special section of the journal about the Australia-New Zealand Alliance, which, as Joanne has noted, is a key feature of our research over the past 6 years. As Joanne has said, the Australia-New Zealand Alliance is both under-examined and intuitive, reflecting the logic of habit built through wide-ranging daily cooperation, whether that be by defence forces, police, diplomatic corps, development officials, economists, and so forth. But as we also argue in our article for the special section, the intuitive nature of the trans-Tasman relationship, which Australia's Deputy Prime Minister Richard Marles has referred to as one of family, may prevent the two countries from recognising and responding to tensions which emerge. And as we've heard already today, the climate in which this alliance is taking place is, of course, increasingly challenging. So while Australia and New Zealand's relationship is seemingly natural and their alliance intuitive, there are differences between the two allies that at times generate tensions. And our article seeks to lay that out, as does a number of the articles in the special section. There are obvious differences in scale, which have consequences for how the two allies perceive themselves. New Zealand sees itself as principled, independent, a small state, and Australia has middle power aspirations and dreams and is very much fulfilling that middle power status. And there are practical consequences of these differences in scale, as we have seen, for instance, in the different levels of defence and policing contributions to the Pacific. For instance, with the Solomon Islands International Assistance Force, which was stood up at the request of the Solomon Islands government during the Honeyara riots in 2021, and then subsequently provided security for the 2023 Pacific Games and the 2024 joint national and provincial elections. It was largely comprised of Australian defence and policing personnel, with a much, much smaller New Zealand contingent. And New Zealand's ability to contribute to and sustain operations in the region, whether in response to disasters or unrest, is very much under question. We argue that these tensions are also often the result of expectations, particularly, as I noted, in the area of defence and security, where Australia has felt some frustration with respect to New Zealand's defence expenditure, and also in the ways in which New Zealand has previously articulated its strategic interests. In our special section, Brendan Taylor evokes, as Joanne has mentioned, Hugh White's different nightmares, and argues that there are three trends contributing to a growing strategic divergence in the relationship between the two countries that threatens its very viability and a deepening drift between the two. The first is Australia's engagement with numerous new security groupings, including AUKUS and the Quad, over the past decade, which has diminished the relative importance of its ties with New Zealand. The second is the strategic personalities of New Zealand and Australia, which Taylor argues are diverging, driven by a widening gap in their defence expenditures and increasingly distinct strategic relationships with the United States. And third, Taylor argues that Canberra and Wellington have embraced different visions for Asia's strategic future, reflecting and exacerbating their divergence. An area of tension we highlight in our article is that of alliance expectations with respect to the ANZUS Treaty, which Joanne has referred to. Indeed, as one Australian official we interviewed argued that while Australia sees its alliances with New Zealand and the United States as an insurance policy and way to extend strategic reach, New Zealand instead sees its alliance with Australia as imposing burdens, bindings, and constraints on action. And much of New Zealand's concern is relating to entrapment arising from Australia's alliance with the United States. We know, for instance, through the contributions to the special section that AUKUS, for example, has generated robust debate about whether New Zealand may be entrapped into supporting Australia in the event of conflict in the broader Indo-Pacific, and whether New Zealand should participate in AUKUS Pillar 2. However, as Joanne and I argue, the intuitive nature of the Australia-New Zealand alliance means that the two countries continue to cooperate closely without absolute agreement about their identified strategic interests, or rather, increasingly now, as we see, differing strategies to manage interests and threats. However, it is also clear that as strategic options are increasingly squeezed as tensions escalate in the Indo-Pacific, there are going to be some significant challenges for the alliance to face. As a consequence of that, Joanne and I propose that the alliance and the broader relationship between Australia and New Zealand could be deepened and widened in a number of ways. There is a clear need for dialogue exchanges and other things such as university study centres as mechanisms to deepen the relationship. There are currently few formal mechanisms to foster policy and academic understanding between Australian and New Zealand officials and academics beyond the infrequent Track 1.5 dialogue that's been held between the Australian Strategic Policy Institute in Canberra and the Centre for Strategic Studies at Victoria University in Wellington. And the last one was held online in 2021. The lack of dialogues, when we consider that in the context of the number of dialogues that are held between, for instance, Australia and ASEAN member states, or Australia and the United States, the lack of dialogues perhaps indeed reflect this intuitive nature of and assumptions about the perceived unchanging nature of the alliance. But as Joanne and I, frequent participants of Track 1.5 and Track 2 mechanisms, we have observed a clear need for Australia and New Zealand to invest in understanding each other better. Equally, there are no research centres in either Australia or New Zealand which have specific research programs focused on the Alliance, and that, of course, limits the opportunities and pathways for graduate students. While there is, for example, the US Studies Centre at the University of Sydney and the Perth US Asia Centre at the University of Western Australia, there is no equivalent separate dedicated New Zealand Studies Centre in Australia linked to a counterpart in New Zealand. There are also areas of strategic convergence which are underexplored. For example, in the special section, Liz Buchanan argues in her contribution that Antarctica, where Australia and New Zealand have shared interests and which is increasingly a site of geopolitical competition, is an opportunity to better leverage the alliance and share the load, such as through joint basing options, for instance. We also identify areas for future research in our article. For example, we acknowledge the limitations of the research and recognise that the settler colonial identities of Australia and New Zealand remain a defining feature of the relationship and the alliance. There is therefore a critical need to understand how Māori and First Nations Australians perceive the alliance and the various ways in which they have been co-opted into it. Beth Greener, in her contribution to the special section, argues that greater inclusion of Te Tiriti o Waitangi in New Zealand foreign policy could have implications for how New Zealand sees itself in the Pacific region and in turn as an alliance partner. So it is clear that the alliance requires reinvigoration, reinvestment, and perhaps, as Joanne and I argue in a recent blog, given escalating tensions in the Indo-Pacific, the alliance perhaps requires recalibration going forward. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Joanne and Anna. I think that's a really useful summary of the contributions to the special section. And I think one of the things I would say to people who are dialing into the webinar who haven't had a chance to look at it yet is one of the things that's refreshing about it is the range of different perspectives. There's no single view there on a whole bunch of issues, and so there's some opportunities for real debate there. Wonderful start. Thank you. We now turn to two of our contributors to the special section. And first up, it's a real pleasure to introduce Darren Lim. Darren, I think, will be well known to many of you joining us. He's Professor of International Relations at the Australian National University, but he's also the host of the excellent Australia in the World podcast, which if you don't listen to, you should. I commend it to you. Darren's piece in the special section was co-authored with Walter Breno Kolnagi. Darren, a really warm welcome to you. Great to have you joining, and over to you to provide us with some remarks.
Terrific. Well, thank you, David, for that generous introduction. And hi, everyone. I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to say a few words about the piece that, as David said, I authored with Walter Kolnagi, who I supervise. He's a PhD student. I'm actually going to try to share my screen. I'm assuming I have kind of the ability to do that here. Let's see if this works. Just to put a couple of visuals on the screen here. Can you guys see that? Looks like you can. Let's see if I can actually start the slideshow here. It's not letting me do that. There we go. All right. The topic of our article and Jason's as well is to look at China. And whereas Hugh White sort of calls them different nightmares, the starting point of our analysis was the famous statement by Alan Gingell, our dear friend who passed away last year, that Australia is strategically insecure but economically secure, while New Zealand is the opposite, of course, much more, sorry, let me start that again. That Australia is strategically insecure and economically quite stable and confident, whereas New Zealand is the opposite. And of course, there's a good history to this. Like probably the defining memory of Australian foreign policy is the fall of Singapore, right? That gave us what Alan called the fear of abandonment and our need to hew closely to a great and powerful friend, then the UK and now the US. Whereas the defining moment of a New Zealand foreign policy is in many ways is the departure of the UK for the European Union in joining the European Economic Community in the 1970s, and the economic shock that brought on the country, which Jason, of course, has written about as well. And so we wanted to try to measure this, right, to get a sense of whether or not it is true in 2023, 2024, that Australia remains right, that has that dichotomy between economic security and strategic vulnerability, and New Zealand has the opposite. And so to start to try to measure that, we thought we needed to theorize it a little bit. And so you can see on this slide here, this simple model where you've got Australian and New Zealand strategic postures caught between great powers. Of course, I don't need to tell the story of trade-offs between our policies between the US and China. And you can see that Australia in the dotted area is a bit closer to the United States to reflect our security prerogatives, that we feel that we need to be closer to the US and we can afford to be a bit more distant from China because the risks, despite our large trading relationship, don't really manifest in that economic relationship. That's the economic security that we've felt. Whereas for New Zealand, it's a bit the opposite, right? With slightly more paranoia or insecurity around maintaining a positive trade relationship with China, a little bit more distance from the US because of that inherent security based upon the geographic location of the country. And so that's sort of the starting point. Like Alan or even what Hugh said in the different nightmares, we thought that was a reasonable way of trying to categorize that. It captures the idea that there are zero-sum choices. When you make a choice, it's going to be pro or either more for the US or more for China. And it captures the idea that there are zones of posture, right? It's not just a single point on that spectrum, but within each zone, the sort of the dark grey area for New Zealand or the dotted area for Australia, the countries can oscillate, right? They're back and forth, driven by domestic politics, which party's in power, which leader makes particular choices. But that the countries themselves are relatively small, and therefore there is a structurally determined band in which that policy sits. And the overlap reflects, of course, the fact that we are very similar countries. We're very good friends with similar histories and values and outlooks on the world. But nevertheless, based upon these structural differences of economic insecurity / security and strategic insecurity / security, you get that divergence. And so given that sort of conceptual framework, then the question becomes, well, how do you measure this? How can you get a sense of how the two countries are dealing with the major strategic challenge of the day, which is our relations with China, and how our foreign policy more broadly affects that relationship? And so Walter and I came up with 7 different indicators, which we were looking then to track over time between the two countries to see if there's any movement, any difference between the two of them, but then any movement in the window of time in which China's rise and its and growing concern about its increasing assertiveness really came to the fore. And we chose a period from around 2017 onwards to capture both that rise in general insecurity felt around the world based on China's rise and assertiveness, but also to capture changes in government across the two countries. You get both a national and a Labor governments, or Labor then national governments in New Zealand, and of course in Australia you have a coalition, Conservative coalition, and then a Labor government. And so we chose these 7 categories, and I'll let you just read through them yourself, to sort of examine how these policy changes moved over time. Of course, I've only got a couple of minutes left, so I can't go through all of them, but I'll just pick 2 in particular to highlight a couple of interesting findings. On category 4, leaders' public communications regarding China and the bilateral relationship. The most interesting thing for us on the New Zealand side was a shift from the historic decision of describing China as New Zealand's relationship with China through the logic of firsts, right? We were the first country to have a free trade agreement, the first to recognise China's market economy status. So really emphasizing a positive nature of that relationship, to one where the guiding principle has been one of maturity. We have a mature relationship with China, right? One that recognizes, of course, that there are tensions, there are disagreements that begin to define that relationship, not just that positive history of the close economic relationship between the two countries. And so that simple messaging difference in how New Zealand leaders talk about China, both to China, but also, more importantly, to the New Zealand public, we saw as a subtle shift away from China and more towards the Australian position, where we are usually quite comfortable in highlighting our disagreements, whether in questions of human rights and security and so forth. The other category, category 5, national security equities in domestic policy. Of course, domestic policy on things like 5G or foreign interference is now very much part of a country's strategic posture vis-a-vis China. If you keep Huawei out of your 5G network, China takes that very personally and sees that as an affront to its national interest. So it's not a cost-free choice. And there you see striking continuity between Australia and New Zealand. Both countries have excluded Huawei, slightly different mechanisms, but ultimately the result was the same. And even on foreign interference, whereas Australia has passed formal legislation, you are seeing increasing, noises being made by New Zealand policymakers that this is a problem, and and calling out things like cyber intrusions and things like that, where again you're seeing more of a shift. And this gets to the basic argument that we have from the piece that what is happening is everyone is feeling more insecure now. Both countries are more insecure strategically. Both countries are more insecure economically. Of course, China, a major practitioner of economic coercion. And that heightening insecurity generally is actually pushing them closer together. And so you can see that visual diagram there of the overlap between the two countries getting larger, and that both are shifting slightly towards the United States. Now, there's a lot more I could say, but I've reached my 7-minute deadline, so I'll stop there and pass it back to you, David. Thank you.
Fantastic, Darren. Hey, thanks so much, and thanks for being so concise. I think there's a lot there in just a 7 minutes or so for us to get stuck into in discussion. So please, if you've got questions, feel free to post them in the Q&A. I think this will neatly segue into Jason as one of the New Zealand contributors to the special section. As I said before, Jason is director of the New Zealand Contemporary China Research Centre. He's joining us actually. This is a real international gathering. We've got Joanne in Adelaide, Darren in Canberra, Anna in Fiji, me in Wellington, and poor Jason is joining us from Paris, where it's 6 o'clock in the morning. My sympathies are limited given you're in Paris, but thanks for getting up so early. And Jason, over to you to talk to us about your piece and how it connects to some of the themes that Darren's mentioned.
Great, thanks, David, and thanks to Joanna and Anna as well for putting together this section. I thought it was a really interesting opportunity to talk about something which is often not talked about so much. So my piece has some crossover, obviously, with Darren's. I guess it's a bit more New Zealand centric, and I guess that's because I'm based in New Zealand. But basically, what I was trying to look at was a comparison of how New Zealand and Australia have approached the China relationship. And I went back a bit further in terms of my historical analysis. And I thought that was really useful. And I came to, I guess, a very similar conclusion to what Darren's come to, which is that both countries have shifted, but that the way that they've shifted their approach to the China relationship has shown some differences. And so when I was thinking about an alliance, I read Robert Ason's piece, which he published in the Australian Journal of International Affairs in 2023. And I thought that he did such a great job that I would instead focus more on, I guess, the policy side of the alliance, as Anna and Joanna were talking about at the beginning, this idea that an alliance can also be formulated in terms of a synchronization or an alignment in terms of how both countries approach big international issues, which of course China is one of those issues. And my main argument is basically that what I found was a sort of a fundamental alignment in how Australia and New Zealand approach China. And there are areas of divergence, in particular areas around sort of security settings or public diplomacy. But I thought that those areas of divergence were actually made for a far stronger New Zealand-Australia alliance relationship. So in terms of the fundamental alignment, if you go back to the Cold War, ANZUS, both countries had diplomatic relations with the Republic of China up until 1972. We switched diplomatic relations to the PRC at pretty much signed on exactly the same day, came into effect one day after the other. Both countries sort of shifted, turned to trying to promote a stronger relationship with China in the 90s, in the early 2000s. Both went into free trade agreement negotiations. Both signed free trade agreements, 2008 for New Zealand, 2015 for Australia. Both countries' business communities really tried to get deeply involved in the China market. And of course, China became Australia's largest trade partner in 2007 and 2017 for New Zealand. But then as the international situation shifted, China's economic growth, its increased military spending, more assertive, proactive foreign policy, I think you see that both countries adjusted their policy towards China. And this rebalancing or recalibration is basically, I think, fundamentally the same for both countries, which is a rebalancing of the risk opportunity calculation when it comes to China. And you can see this in how prime ministers currently articulate the relationship with China. So in New Zealand, they talk about engaging and cooperating in areas of common interest, acting to secure New Zealand's interests and working with partners. And in Australia, they talk about cooperating with China where we can, disagreeing where we must, and engaging in the national interest. So there's been this real refocus in both countries on more clearly defining what's in the national interest and what's not in the national interest when it comes to China. In the New Zealand case, which I focused mostly on, you can see that that recalibration came about from around about 2016, largely driven by concern around China's position on the South China Sea, questions of international law. In that regard, then of course there's human rights. We have had a foreign interference debate as well, and currently there's legislation going through the New Zealand Parliament around foreign interference. And of course, we've also had more public criticism and public attribution of cybersecurity issues. And then I think also for both countries, the recalibration is linked very closely to China's engagement in the Pacific. But of course, even though both countries have recalibrated, the Australian recalibration has led to a more dramatic response and a more dramatic, stronger response from Beijing, which leads to some of these questions around divergence. And I think it'd be interesting to hear what others think, but I think that a lot of that is actually to do with Beijing rather than to do with New Zealand or Australia's position or how either country forwards its diplomacy and foreign policy. So the other piece in my article was sort of putting forth this idea of loyal opposition, which is sort of at the heart of both Australian and New Zealand democracies. This idea that yes, there's sort of shared interests, there's a shared approach, there's a synchronization to how we do our foreign policy. But of course, we are independent sovereign nations, and it's actually very healthy and very useful for there to be some divergences in approaches to shared challenges and shared questions in international relationships. So basically sort of re-articulating this idea that loyalty to shared goals, but there's also a respect between both countries for an independence of view and an independence of action. And what I found was also that some of these divergences which you see are really temporal, so that there's sort of a first mover advantage that often a larger country like Australia will have, and it's New Zealand doesn't sort of follow lockstep in terms of its reappraisal and different approach to issues like China. So the two issues I focused on for this was one was the change in rhetoric, and I completely agree with Darren that New Zealand has shifted its rhetoric on China, particularly moving away from the first language to one of mature or evolving relationship. But also, I think the change in political rhetoric in Australia was far stronger and far more critical overtly. And then the interesting thing is that then that shifted back. And so there's a sort of a divergence and then a convergence. And then the second one I focused on was, I guess, the security posture, and in particular, security spending. And I think Australia moved to articulate that the geostrategic region was no longer a benign strategic environment far sooner than New Zealand did. but New Zealand has also shifted in that direction, but yet to I guess, increase the resources in the same way that Australia has. So my article was basically arguing, in conclusion, that New Zealand and Australia share similar opportunities and approaches, and that it's actually very constructive to see a little bit of divergence in the approaches that we take to China.
Okay, thanks very much, Jason. That's terrific, and it's interesting to see the intersection of the two arguments that you and Darren both put forward. Got a couple of questions coming in on the Q&A. What I might do is just put a few questions into the mix and ask Darren, Jason, and perhaps Anna and Joanne to come back to some of these questions. Darren, I mean, one of the things you talk about in your broader work, obviously, is economic security strategies and strategies for pursuing economic resilience. I guess one of the lessons that Australia might take from its experience with China's economic coercion is actually a degree of self-confidence in some ways, in that it came through that. But my sense is that Australia has implemented a strategy of pursuing economic security in quite an explicit and well-developed way. You've been in New Zealand. I wonder if maybe if you could give a sense of what lessons there might be for New Zealand, or if you think there are similar approaches in thinking about those risks or differences. So I'll just leave that with you for a second. Anna and Joanne, you might want to come back on this one. There's a question here from two questions that are related to the alliance more generally. From Samsach Deva, thinking about the Australia-New Zealand more broadly, we've obviously had the Labour Party here in New Zealand in the last week come out and rule about any involvement in Pillar 2 of AUKUS. And Sam says, would it have any impact on the political and policy debate about AUKUS in Australia? And so I'd be curious if you had a response on that. And also related to that bigger question, Jim Rolfe, the questions are coming in thick and fast now. This is great. When did this self-conscious use of this term of alliance start to be used between Australia and New Zealand? Jim says it was really something that's a bit more recent. So I don't know if it wasn't really a relationship of alliance between that level of formality as two Commonwealth nations, but seems to be something more recent. And then Jason and also Joanne, Anna, Darren, question from Malcolm McKinnon. Could one of the panelists comment on divergences or similarities in Australia and New Zealand's dealings with the Taiwan Strait and the South China Sea? So broad questions about AUKUS, about economic security resilience, but also the Taiwan Strait. Don't feel you have to answer all of those, but maybe Darren, seeing I've given you slightly longer than the others to think of an answer, if I could maybe come to you first.
I would start by slightly challenging the premise of the question that Australia was really lent into economic security. Yes, the government has messaged consistently that there is a higher degree of political risk in doing business with China. And yes, the pandemic highlighted a bunch of fragilities that we want to take action on. But in terms of concrete policy action by the government, you don't see a lot. And what you do see is really inseparable from a domestic policy agenda of decarbonisation, jobs, economic growth. And this is, of course, future made in Australia. You know, our lesson from the coercion episode was that we were fairly resilient, that the industries that were most sensitive to us were also most sensitive to the Chinese and were untouched. And so I don't really think it affected, I mean, it heightened a general sense of insecurity amongst the broader public that China was much more of a risk now than it was a partner. But it didn't really shift the calculus for business, in a sense that if there is still money to be made, they will go and make money. And you've seen them pile back into the Chinese market when blockages have been removed. And to the extent that it did change government thinking, it didn't change government thinking so much that the government sees the need to actually tell businesses, you are now going to diversify with a +1 strategy or whatever. We're still very much hands off. Markets will do what markets do. So I think from a New Zealand, in terms of lessons, I think the first lesson is to really do the analysis of what happens if you experience that demand shock. Is it that you actually cannot sell your produce, which happened for lobsters for us? Or is it more that you just would get a lower price and possibly a bit more hassle to sell your stock, like happened with most of our other, commodities? And that's going to be a sector by sector analysis. And my suspicion is, given the high quality of your milk products and your beef products, that you probably would be able to get, sell those products. And given that trade is not, a huge part of your GDP, that the economic impact would be not as serious as people would might suppose, but that work still needs to be done. And that's of course not to say that this means you can just be a complete cowboy and do whatever you want vis-a-vis China. Prudence is always recommended, but I think the expectation or the assumption, both in the Tasman region but across the entire region, is that economic coercion is a terrifying thing that we need to avoid. And I think the record on this shows that actually, when it's sort of focused on exports going into China, there usually are alternatives. We have a good trading system and markets can adjust, and therefore it's not quite as scary as it's made out to be. Thanks.
Thanks, Darren. Really, really helpful. Jason, can I come to you? Maybe you want to pick up on some of those themes around economic security, maybe diversification, but also perhaps Malcolm's question about the Taiwan Straits and South China Sea.
Yeah, thanks. I think I'll just focus on the Taiwan Strait question if I can, because I think that's one that actually shows sort of highlights why there is some divergence, but there's a lot of commonality and sort of a fundamental alignment. So I think if you look at the diplomatic positions that both New Zealand and Australia have taken when establishing diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China, they're basically exactly the same. So recognize the PRC and acknowledge the PRC's position on Taiwan, but then set up unofficial trade and economic relations, and in recent years raise more concerns about instability on the Taiwan Strait. New Zealand and Australia recently sailed through the Taiwan Strait, and also have both countries have sort of deepened that economic relationship with Taiwan. But of course, Australia is a far larger country. It has more assets and it has more impact in terms of its the actions that it does, and so often there's seen to be a bit of a divergence where I actually don't think there is much of a divergence at all. And just quickly on economic coercion, I think that Australia's experience shaped New Zealand's understanding of China and played a huge part in part of that recalibration of New Zealand policy towards China, particularly because we are basically one market. And so a lot of New Zealand businesses had a very close understanding of the Australian experience.
Thanks, Jason. And maybe if I could just maybe add a couple of sentences about South China Sea. I think that's just another example where there is that growing convergence between Australia and New Zealand. Certainly in the last 6 or 7 months, in the last 6 years, we've seen a more vocal New Zealand in terms of expressing concerns about what's going on there. But in the last 6 months, of course, we've seen New Zealand take part in multilateral maritime exercises in the South China Sea with the Philippines and Japan and Australia. And also it's interesting just the level of coordination, or at least commonalities in terms of expressing concerns. A lot of the statements that Australia and New Zealand are making about what's going on in the South China Sea right now and around Second Thomas Shoal have been coming out of their respective embassies in Manila. And if you just look in the last 24 hours or so, both have issued similar tweets expressing concern. So I think that's just another example of convergence. Anna and Joanne, do you want to come back on some of those larger points about AUKUS, about Labor Party policy, and perhaps about the alliance, and then we'll come back for some more questions.
I'll start from the Australian perspective and then I'll hand over to Anna from the New Zealand one. On the question about the New Zealand Labor Party undertaking that it wouldn't be involved in AUKUS Pillar 2 if it was invited, and what effect that would have on its relationship with Australia. I mean, a lot of the questions about AUKUS are really up in the air with the new Trump administration. We don't know ourselves what AUKUS will look like under Trump and whether Pillar 2 will will end up coming to anything. And I here commend you to Darren's recent episode of Australia in the World podcast. And there were some very interesting comments in there by Zach Cooper about that, which I found very helpful for my thinking. But if we assume that the Trump administration does continue with AUKUS in its current form or close to, I think the concern in Australia will be about the long-standing concerns that Australians have often had about the defence capability gap with New Zealand, and whether New Zealand not being involved in AUKUS Pillar 2 could just further widen that gap. And related to that, there is this stated intention, and it was very heavily emphasised at the first ANZMAN meeting, about achieving not just greater interoperability between the two defence forces, but actually greater integration. And again, if New Zealand is not participating in AUKUS Pillar 2, and AUKUS Pillar 2 does eventually materialise into quite a substantive program of capability acquisition for Australia, that's just going to create issues with that program of interoperability and integration. At the same time, it's really interesting how the two countries' defence forces are just getting on with it. So, 2023, we saw Plan ANZAC between the two armies. Week before last, we saw the Tasman Navy framework between the two navies, both of them both saying that they want to enhance their dialogue, their cooperation, and so forth. So, there will still be things other than AUKUS Pillar 2 that will help the two countries to cooperate together. On the question about Jim's question about the use of the word alliance, and thank you, Jim. Jim was our Wellington workshop. It's really interesting. There was, of course, the ANZUS Council that did sit for many years after the ANZUS Treaty was signed. So the alliance language and framework was implemented by the ANZUS Council. Of course, that then collapsed after the New Zealand-US aspect of ANZUS collapsed. But it's really interesting, the reluctance, particularly in New Zealand, and we found this during our fieldwork, to refer to the relationship as an alliance. And, we saw this, that we cite this example in our article of when the 2016 Defence White Paper was released in New Zealand. And Prime Minister at the time, John Key, came out and really kind of seemed to say, look, ANZUS is over. We have a different kind of relationship with Australia. And he seemed reluctant to use the language of ANZUS as an alliance. But at the ANZMIN earlier this year, your new Prime Minister was very strongly emphasising the alliance language. So I think it's very much kind of maybe a bellwether of how New Zealand is feeling domestically with whoever's in power at the time, but also feeling about what's happening in the world more broadly. And we are facing a more uncertain world. So that might be a reason why New Zealand leaders in particular are wanting to emphasise that alliance language. But I'll defer to Annie here, who will be able to speak with far more authority about New Zealand.
Thanks, Joanne. I think what I would just add to that is just to reinforce the fact that one of the very clear messages that we received as when we were interviewing people on both sides of the Tasman actually was this reluctance to use the word alliance, and rather using relationship or even family and other types of terminology to describe the closeness and the naturalness between the two countries. And the way in which the term alliance in some quarters was seen perhaps negatively even, but with, as Joanne was just describing, the greater strategic integration between the two countries, the fact that there is an enormous amount of infrastructure built sort of below sort of both at the national but sub-national levels as well, which really integrates. And I noticed the question before about the trans-Tasman travel arrangements, and the fact that that's very much, since 1973, very much the foundation of people-to-people links between the two countries. And this is why, one of the things that we've been thinking about as part of this work is as the strategic environment becomes increasingly challenged, how does New Zealand particularly articulate the importance and value of the alliance to the domestic New Zealand public? Because the New Zealand public's often a little bit uncomfortable with this notions, and we see through the contributions by Marco de Jong and Robert Patman, for instance, who write extensively in the special section about AUKUS Pillar 2, and both present various different perspectives on why that would not be advantageous for New Zealand to sign up to that. As those conversations and as those debates become more intense in New Zealand, the New Zealand government is really going to have to think about how to articulate the sharper, pointier end of the alliance to the domestic public, much more so. But I would also just add quickly is that the New Zealand and Australia relationship obviously plays out significantly in the Pacific region as well. And there are a number of payoffs for New Zealand. And by that I mean is that as New Zealand has become increasingly, it becomes more overtly closer to Australia and have more overtly articulating strategic concerns in alignment with Australia, there is a greater divergence between New Zealand and its Pacific neighbours, and that's something that Marco talks about in his article, and we see that very much playing out. And because that sort of dynamic between Australia and New Zealand has always been really quite useful to both countries, that they're seen as slightly different within the region. But as New Zealand and Australia become closer and that dynamic shrinks, New Zealand is really going to have to tackle some serious questions about the way in which it sees itself within the Pacific. Thanks. Thanks, David.
Thanks very much, Anna. Okay, time is racing by, but I've got a couple more questions here, and so I'll go back to Darren and Jason firstly, and then perhaps we'll come back. I mean, Gary Hawke raises the bigger question about the US here and the outcome of the Trump administration and what that means for the way that Wellington and Canberra are both thinking about the changing regional order. Gary says everybody is reluctant to acknowledge that US primacy has declined. Recognition is more challenging for Australia than it is for New Zealand. Is there any trans-Tasman discussion of how this evolution should be managed? So I don't know if anybody wants to provide maybe some general comments on how this sort of the unpredictability that we might see over the next little while might play out into the trans-Tasman relationship.
I mean, if I'm going to apply my framework, I would expect, given what Trump has said and given what his election says about sort of the political space for foreign policy in US politics, that you would see a shift towards away from the US in both countries at the margins. And so some things that were formerly inconceivable now become conceivable, and other things that were routine become harder. And one example of that is it becomes politically easier for a party. In this case, I'm thinking of the New Zealand Labor Party. And I'm sure the timing of this was actually before Trump's election, wasn't it? When they came out and said no Pillar 2, or was it after?
After.
It was after. Well, even easier then, right? So once Trump's coming into the White House, it just becomes politically easier to take a position like we're never going to join Pillar 2, because it's hard to come at you from the right on that. And so, this is how these structural shifts at the geopolitical level create the space, right, for political parties to take their own positions, again within a band, but still, but that band itself was also shifting. Thanks.
Thanks, Darren. Jason, did you have anything to add to that?
No, not really. I mean, I think I'll just go back to the AUKUS conversation a little bit if I can, because I think it's really, really fascinating the way that has become such a focus when, as both Anna and Joanna were articulating, the defence and security relationship between New Zealand and Australia is very strong, and there's lots and lots and lots of different mechanisms. But then adding the AUKUS to the conversation has become a real focal point for a broader criticism of, I guess, the deteriorating geostrategic environment. And in particular, China has made it a very a point of principle for trying to understand New Zealand's position in geostrategic position. And I think, the fact that Australia is in AUKUS and in Pillar 1, but the relationship between Australia and China is quote unquote getting back on track, whereas New Zealand's not, but talking about potential participation in Pillar 2, but that has become a real focal point and a real challenge in the relationship, is really quite an interesting dynamic.
Thanks, Jason. We are almost out of time. I think the lesson that we can take from this the last 59 minutes is that there's a lot to discuss in the bilateral relationship. Probably need to have a longer webinar. I wonder, Anna and Joanne, if maybe if I can just come back to you to close on this, seeing it's your special section, and congratulations again. I mean, earlier this year we saw this declaration from, I think it was the two prime ministers, about the applicability of the ANZUS alliance between Australia and New Zealand in the case of a cyber attack, or an attempt to try and put it in a contemporary context. Just to close, are there specific things that you think could be done to modernize the bilateral alliance to make it fit for the 21st century? You talked about some of the supporting infrastructure around universities and building a sort of a broader constituency, but are there particular things in the hard power and the military dimensions that you think would be useful? Maybe we'll close with that as a general question.
I'm going to answer that, but also just link it to the question about the US, David. I think, with facing the uncertainty of what the Trump administration means, I think Australia would be wise to be pursuing, or not just pursuing, but to be working on other minilateral arrangements like the Quad with India and Japan and the US, and looking more to ASEAN and to other partnerships, to its relationships with bilateral relationships with Indonesia, Japan, South Korea, and others. But New Zealand will be one of those important other ally and partner in offering maybe a sort of a not soft balancing isn't quite the word, but a sense that there are other options that maybe that groups of states might need to get together at times to perhaps temper some of the US's the Trump administration's potentially more outlandish foreign and strategic policy initiatives. So I think that would be my recommendation, is to think about how the New Zealand alliance could fit within a network of different minilateral arrangements aimed at providing alternative voices in international debates.
Thanks, Joanne. Anna, you got the last word.
Thanks, David. I think I would just reiterate that there has been a reluctance to institutionalize the reliance. I recall one person that we interviewed referring to the sort of the unspoken architecture that makes up the alliance. But we would argue, as we do argue in the article, that there actually needs to be greater effort to really institutionalize that alliance and to prioritize it in ways that we may see, for instance, between the relationship between Australia and the United States, or between New Zealand and the United States. And that will only serve to deepen and broaden the understanding between the two countries, and to put in place the types of arrangements and mechanisms and relationships that are going to be potentially needed if tensions are to worsen within the region.
Thanks very much, Anna. I guess in the spirit of that institutionalization, with a 2+2 tomorrow, the second one this year, it'll be interesting to have a look at the joint statement that comes out of that, and read through the tea leaves, what that tells us about the trajectory of greater convergence that we've heard about so far this evening. Look, I'm afraid time has gone too quickly. Some of you, I realize Darren has kindly answered some questions directly in the Q&A. To those of you we didn't get to your questions, apologies, but thanks very much to everybody for joining us. Can I thank Darren Lim and Jason Young for joining us as contributors to the special section, and can I also thank and congratulate Anna Poles and Joanne Wallace for a really terrific contribution to the conversation about something we need to be talking a lot more about, the Trans-Tasman Alliance. I'm afraid we're out of time, but thanks so much for joining us, and we'll look forward to having the opportunity to do this again sometime soon. Thanks, and haere.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.